Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program. My name is Katie, and I'm a librarian here at the main library downtown. First of all, I would like to thank the Grand Rapids Public Library Foundation for funding our GR Reads programs, and thank you to our media sponsor, Wood TVA. I'm so happy to introduce our speaker, Dr. Martin Reinhardt. He is an Anishinaabe Ojibwe citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians from Michigan. He's a tenured professor and chair of Native American Studies at Northern Michigan University. He is the president of the Michigan Indian Education Council and the lead singer and songwriter for the band Wawiyaya. His current research focuses on revitalizing relationships between humans and indigenous plants and animals of the Great Lakes region. He's taught courses in American Indian education, tribal law and government, and sociology. He has a PhD in educational leadership from the Pennsylvania State University, where his doctoral research focused on Indian education and the law with a special focus on treaty educational provisions. Martin serves as a panelist for the National Indian Education Study Technical Review Panel and as the primary investigator for the Decolonizing Diet Project. He has also served as the chair of the American Association for Higher Education American Indian and as an external advisor for the National Indian School Board Association. He also holds both a bachelor's and master's degree in sociology. Welcome, Dr. Reinhardt.
Miigwech, thank you. I am very pleased to be with you all this evening. I'm going to share my screen and bring up my PowerPoint. I was telling Katie at any point during the presentation this evening, if you have questions, please go ahead and post them either in the Q&A or chat. I think, Katie, you'll be monitoring those. And so she can let me know if in case I missed them. All right, Katie, how are we looking? Great. Okay. So just a little bit about the title of the presentation, The Good Life is Our Birthright. That's something that my friend Winona LaDuke said when she came and presented at Central Michigan University a long time ago when I was working there as the director of the Native American Center. In our language, Anishinaabe, the good life, Minobimaadiz, is how we describe the medicine wheel and what it symbolizes. And so it really is a matter of balance and harmony in nature. The good life is all of our birthright. And so that's really what this is about. These studies that we've been doing is trying to study and think about the relationship between humans and food and trying to revitalize those relationships as best we can. That picture there, that's from one of our activities we did with youth, cooking on an open fire. And so it's a really fun, exciting time when we get an opportunity to interact with children and teach them how to prepare food, not just Pop-Tarts and ramen noodles, but actual real food, and get to know the plants and animals as spirit beings. So today I'm going to talk about a few studies. We have 4 studies essentially that I'm going to focus on. One is the Decolonizing Diet Project, or DDP. The second is a treaty food provision study. The third is an Indigenous Foods traditional ecological knowledge study focused on the Great Lakes region. And the last one is the Great Lakes Indigenous Materials Poop study. And yes, you heard it correctly, poop study. So, we go from everything that goes into our mouth to what comes out the other end. And we're trying to have a comprehensive view of that. So we'll talk more about that as we get to it. The image on this slide here is from my mom's family, the Byron family over in Garden River, Ontario, Gitigan Zibing. And this is a sugar bush. way back in the day, the family would get together and they would make maple products, whether that's syrup or sugar or candy. And so that's a kind of a cool picture of indigenous foods from my own family history. I also wanted to put a shout out. I seen Rhonda Hoffman was one of the participants today. Rhonda is my cousin through my adoptive father's family, Fred Reinhardt Jr. is how I became a Reinhardt. German-American influenced family, and learned a lot of really cool things about food from the Reinhardts as well, big farming family. So the first thing I'll talk about is the Decolonizing Diet Project. This photo here is my wife, Tina Moses, who also is Anishinaabe Ojibwe, and we were out wild ricing in this photo. This is over on Lac Vieux Desert, and it's a really fun time when you go out ricing. This would happen to be a really nice sunny day in the fall, just around a little bit later than this time of the year, and the rice was just falling off of the stalks. But you have to pull through the rice fields, and then someone, I was doing that, pulling through there, and then someone knocks them in the stalks, so the rice falls into the canoe, and then some of it, of course, falls back into the water, which replenishes for next year, and for other beings that eat wild rice. The region of the Decolonizing Diet Project was the Great Lakes region, as we defined it. And we didn't realize that it was going to turn out looking like a bear head until we got our map completed. But if you look at the outline, it does look like a bear head there. But anyway, the Great Lakes region encompasses parts of Minnesota, Iowa, Missouri, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, New York, and Ontario, and the entire states of Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and the state of Michigan. And it goes to the height of the land in Ontario, all the way from Montreal over to Rainy Lake, and then on the just west of the Mississippi River down to the confluence of the Mississippi and the Ohio and the Wabash. One of the most important things that we needed to do for all of these studies was to define what it is we're calling indigenous foods. And so we thought that there was two primary ways that people should understand. One is food in relationship to themselves. So we're talking about the plants and animals and their traditional homelands, how they have lived here even before humans have lived here. And so, when we came along, they had already established themselves as the beings who lived here. And then we also talk about it in relationship to indigenous peoples. So indigenous peoples may have deep historical, shared, and spiritual connections to the foods through their ancestral food experience. Now, some folks may not necessarily have that shared connection as though it's part of their daily lives. Those connections have been disrupted, through boarding schools, through reservationalization, relocation, assimilation. There's a number of things that have disrupted the relationship between indigenous peoples and indigenous foods, but they do still share an ancestral connection, even though they themselves may not have personally experienced these connections as their ancestors have or had. We also created criteria for determining what foods would be considered eligible for the Decolonizing Diet Project and which foods would not be considered eligible. And so the eligible column you can see there in gold is native precolonials, and these were foods that were not introduced by humans deliberately or accidentally into the Great Lakes region. We also have introduced precolonials. These are the foods that were introduced by humans deliberately or accidentally prior to colonization. An example of a native precolonial would be like the mallard duck. And so mallard ducks were here before humans, and they have been here since. Also, what cattails were here in the Great Lakes region prior to humans. So there's a number of things that were here prior to humans. And introduced pre-colonial, the best example I can give you is corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters. And a lot of folks, it's kind of trendy to do three sisters gardens and three sisters meals, like casseroles and such these days. But those were introduced into the Great Lakes region by humans. Those did not come here by themselves. And so we actually have stories, traditional stories about how they came to these places. And those stories are told in the winter time. We also have native pre-colonial derivations. And so I had mentioned the mallard duck. And some of you may know that we have the domesticated species of ducks often that are part of our diets, although it's even unusual there. Most people eat chicken or turkey, but a lot of people don't eat duck. But the Pekin ducks, like what duck you see on the Aflac commercial, Aflac, they are actually derived from mallards. So they're a domesticated variety of mallards. And we did include anything that was domesticated as eligible for the Decolonizing Diet Project. Same with the introduced pre-colonial derivations. There are so many varieties of corn, beans, and squash that have since derived from the original corn, beans, and squashes that existed here in a pre-colonial context. And so we included them as well. Those things that we did not include were the introduced colonials. And so things like pork, we did not include pork in the diet. We also did not include oats, even though oats, oatmeal is good for it's heart healthy. It was introduced in a colonial context. So we did not include that. We also did not include anything that derived from those introduced colonial foods, nor did we include anything that has been genetically modified, whether it was introduced in a colonial context or a pre-colonial context. If it has been genetically modified, like genetically modified corn, we did not include that. So people had to be aware if the foods they were eating were genetically modified or not. And if they were genetically modified, they were not considered eligible foods. We also spent a couple of years preparing for the Decolonizing Diet Project. One of the things we did was create a master list of DDP eligible foods to help people identify the plants, the mammals, the birds, fish, fungi, insects, amphibians, reptiles, mussels, and other. And in our identification, we tried to provide the scientific name, common names, and where we found them, the names in Anishinaabe. So I'm going to get right into the outcomes, and I'm going to talk about them from different perspectives, including biological, cultural, and legal political. I love Venn diagrams, by the way, if you can't tell. So our biological outcomes, we know from a statistical analysis of our group data that we had significant reductions in weight. We also had significant reductions in girth and BMI, which is a constant based on height, weight, and girth. We also had noteworthy or significant individual outcomes, not group outcomes, in reductions in blood pressure and in cholesterol and in blood glucose levels. And so for American Indian populations especially, the reductions in weight was a major finding, a major outcome because of the propensity of obesity in our communities. We have a lot of folks who are obese, and obesity also lends then to heart disease and diabetes, which are two of the primary killers in Indian country. And so the decrease in blood glucose levels for the diabetics and the decrease in cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, triglycerides, and LDL, that was a major outcome That means just by eating indigenous foods and increasing our activity level, we were able to affect two of the primary killers of Native people. We also had non-Native people, though, who participated in the study. And certainly non-Native people benefit from these biological outcomes as well. But in Indian country, those are the two of the primary killers. So that was a major finding for Indian folks. On a sociocultural level, we also had some major outcomes. We found that family and community support was very significant. In fact, it was probably one of the most important factors in people being able to continue on and do the hard work that's required for this type of activity. We also had a transformation of space to accommodate DDP needs. And I can tell you, my wife and I, we had to take a lot of stuff off our shelves and get new shelves and new refrigerator. We had to create like a double space in our home for food and for food processing, because a lot of the foods we were creating, you cannot find in a store. We were going out and foraging and hunting and gathering. And in those things, then you have to prepare them and store them yourself. And so it's a lot of time that you're spending on DDP stuff. And that's why I say their time commitment was a major source of anxiety. I can tell you, being the leader of this project, trying to set the example, I did not get much sleep during our implementation year, which was 2012 to 2013. I spent a lot of time writing and processing foods and hunting, fishing, gathering, gardening, and having get-togethers. And that's all on top of having a full-time job and being a father. And so there was a lot of time commitment. We did have a small impact on local markets, the economy, but we had a large impact for some businesses. For instance, we didn't make much of an impact on the large chain stores, but we did impact them somewhat. They started offering things that we requested. But like the Marquette Food Co-op, oh my gosh, they were like labeling things DDP eligible for us in the store. And they were making sure they had well-stocked DDP eligible products. So that was really cool. And that's a relationship that still has an impact on the food co-op here in Marquette to this day. They still stock DDP food items. Although they've curtailed the labeling, I don't think the whole lot of people know what DDP means. So now they have curtailed that. There were different expectations for males and females especially at the beginning of the project. There was this expectation that males were the ones that would go out and fish and hunt. And there was this other expectation that females were more likely to garden and forage. And then I think there was also a propensity that people thought of females as the ones who would be doing most of the cooking. Now, I can tell you, in my home, I do most of the cooking. And so even though there was this kind of expectation from the get-go, by the end of the DDP, I think there was a much less of that kind of expectation for gender differentiated relations with food. Price and convenience were also major factors. And I think if you're looking at it from an economic or social perspective, this may be the one way that we can really impact people eating indigenous foods, is to drive down the price and make them more convenient. The more likely that folks who participated in the study were to find their foods in the stores at lower prices, the more likely they were to eat them. It's easier and it's cheaper. And so that was what we found. The people don't want to spend a lot of money, and these are specialty foods. So, if you're going to be using the marketplace to feed yourself indigenous foods, you're going to do it on the cheap, most likely, unless you have a lot of expendable cash. And so that's a major finding, and I think that's something that has held constant. We started with 10 Native research subjects and 15 non-Native, and then we finished with 12 Native and 7 non-Native. We had some of the non-Native people were eaten by the Native people. No, I'm just kidding. We had some people who fell out during the project. because of family commitments or other factors. And we did end up accepting replacements for folks up until the halfway mark. So we figured after the halfway mark that we weren't going to have enough data, so we only accepted people up to the 6-month mark. Let's see, Katie, you want to throw some of those questions or comments at us? Take a little bit of a break.
Sure, yeah, it looks like we've got a question from Abby. It says, I might have missed it, but could you elaborate on the biological outcomes slide for the DDP? How long did the study participants eat these foods, and how many people took part in the study?
Yeah, great. So we had 25 of us who were the primaries, and then we had at the beginning 2 alternates. And the alternates were just kind of going along doing the same things, and then if somebody dropped out, they were brought in as fully fledged research subjects, or what we call participants, because I just didn't like the term subjects. And then, we had people followed even after that. So, it was a year-long commitment, and folks had to get physicals before and after, and quarterly checkups during. They were also supposed to work with their physicians to increase their level of physical activity as appropriate to their conditions. And so with that, we were trying to mimic the amount of physical activity that our ancestors would have had in a pre-colonial context. We even went into the gym, and the Northern Michigan University Exercise Science, they did some research for us on the kind of activity that would have been historic in this area for our native ancestors. And then they created these kind of exercises we could do with kettlebells and, different activities, not necessarily like out in the woods or in the lakes, but within a gymnasium. So it was interesting. My wife and I, we ended up parking way out in the parking lots to go shopping, for instance. And then we were, doing a lot more walking, and then we would also, try to increase our lifting of things. But it was, it depends on the abilities of the folks who were in the study. Was there another question?
There's a couple in the chat. Let me see here.
Okay.
Could this project be replicable or scaled up or down by interested communities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, in fact, we've had folks who have done similar projects based on the DDP. We had one that was done with Apache out in the Southwest. We had one in the Rocky Mountain region, one up in Montana. In fact, we even had an interaction with Aboriginal Australians who were thinking of doing something similar, and they wanted to consult with us about our study. And so, yeah, we've had a number of folks. And folks, we started doing this back, planning for this in 2010, implemented the implementation phase 2012 to 2013. And so we were right at the beginning of the food sovereignty, Indigenous foods movement. And, there was only a handful of studies at that point in time. Now we see there's all kinds of stuff going on. It's spread like wildfire. It's trending so hard right now that it has a life of its own. People are really, as far as revitalizing Native culture, they're centering on food sovereignty.
Let's see, here's another one. How did you determine which foods were growing in the Great Lakes area before human settlement?
Yeah, so we utilized the USDA foods database, or plants database, and then similar databases for mammals and fish and fungi and you name it. When we had questions about the nativity of plants, we consulted with people who I'd consider like bean gurus or corn gurus. These are the folks who have written extensively about the history of these plants. And we would just literally email them and call them and say, hey, tell us about this. And they were very generous with their time. And, some of them stayed on the phone with us for hours, just, talking about what it is we were up to and their work. And so the master food list It has over 500 entries into it. And sometimes we will put things in there. Sometimes we'll take them back out. It depends on the argument that people put forth for why it should appear there or why it shouldn't. These have all been found in our research. And sometimes we take things out when someone says, yeah, you might not want to keep that in there. That could be harmful to people if they did it the wrong way, or, or they'll say it was mostly used as a medicine, not as a food. And so we have taken some things out. And then some things we just, we didn't think to put in. We overlooked it. And so someone will point something out and we'll add it to the list. And so it truly is an organic list in more than one way. Okay.
We've got maybe one more here.
Sure.
Let's see, were there only adults in the study, or were families such as your own with children part of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. We had couples, and we had only adults who were actually research participants based on the institutional review board requirements that I had to contend with at Northern Michigan University. However, what the families did on their own was up to them. And so in our family, Tina, my wife, and I, we were both research participants. And then our daughters ate a lot of the foods that we made. Our younger daughter, Dobby, she was living at home at the time, and she would eat a lot of our foods. And it's kind of funny because leeks or wild ramps, they're very much like onions or garlicky tasting and smelling, very potent. She would eat a lot of those with us, and she went to school, and she had a teacher who was pregnant at the time, and she had to ask Dobby not to bring those things to school because it was making her nauseous, the smell. And so Dobby asked that we not put those in her lunch and when she was going to school anymore. But it was it depends. We also had two couples who had young children. We had two moms who were breastfeeding at the time, and we did not have anyone pregnant during the Decolonizing Diet Project at the beginning, but we did have one mom who did get pregnant during the Decolonizing Diet Project. And so, yeah, we take credit for that love that blossomed between two of our DDP research participants, and then they ended up having a DDP baby. So we take full credit for that. They're still going strong. Okay, I'm going to go on with the presentation a little bit just so we can move along a bit. And then if there are other questions, we'll take a time out again soon. I did want to talk a little bit about the legal and political outcomes. The treaty rights and the treaty boundaries, if you look at the image there on the screen, the Upper Peninsula, we're located at the edge of the yellow and the blue, the light blue in Marquette. So about half way across the Upper Peninsula on the Lake Superior shoreline. That's where Northern Michigan University is located. And we had people who are participating in this who were part of the 1836 treaty ceded territory, which is yellow. And we had people who were part of the 1842 treaty ceded territory, which is light blue. And so depending on what side of the line you're on, you have different rights. And we also had folks who were non-native, and we also had folks who were other tribes that did not belong in those two treaty ceded territory area rights groups. And so it was interesting to see how that impacted people's ability to access food. I'm a 1836 treaty ceded territory person, so I could go out in the yellow area and during our tribal seasons, I'm allowed to take 5 deer. My wife was allowed to take 5 deer. We can also go out and gather and fish. And so, we exercise our treaty rights, and we make a point of that. We report it back to our tribe on an annual basis. But we have different limits and different rules that we follow as compared to the Anishinaabe Indian community, which is in the 1842 side of the line. They can spotlight deer. We can't. Our seasons are somewhat different, and our rules are somewhat different. On an organizational level, we also had some limitations. Northern Michigan University does not take well to non-NMU types as far as using NMU resources. And so, parking was an issue for non-NMU types. Website access was limited for non-NMU people. We do not allow potlucks on our campus for safety reasons. And so we had to go off campus, which was funny because there was a church that's just across the road from the Center for Native American Studies. And we just simply walked across the road. And, so it's just kind of silly that a research project approved by our institutional review board at our university would not preclude this rule against having potlucks, but it did. So we made do, we went across the road. And then I also, I smuggled DDP eligible food into the movie theater, and I broke some of those social rules outside of the university in our society for when you're supposed to buy food from the places you go. And sometimes eating my own food in restaurants just because I wanted to socialize. I wanted to be part of, people's lives. And when you're 100% eating DDP eligible foods, they don't serve DDP food at restaurants, and they don't serve DDP food at the movie theater. So, in order to accommodate my needs, I had to break some rules. There are a few publications that are out if folks are interested. The top one is the Decolonizing Diet Project Cookbook, and that one has some of our best recipes. You don't want our worst ones, so they're not in there. But those are our best recipes from the year. And so right now I'm teaching a class called Decolonizing with Indigenous Foods. It's a summer class, and our last class is tomorrow evening. And so the students in that class had to create a decolonized meal on a weekly basis during this summer session, and then post their experience on the DDP Facebook site. And so that was pretty cool. And a lot of them, of course, are using recipes right from the DDP cookbook, although some of them are using other resources as well. If you want more of the academic explanation of the DDP, I encourage you to get the book Indigenous Innovation, Universalities and Peculiarities. We have a chapter in that book called Spirit Food, a Multidimensional Overview of the Decolonizing Diet Project, which kind of goes deeper than this presentation that I am doing for you all here this evening. These are links to the Facebook site. The Facebook site is the most active site now. The group site still has the master food list, and you can still see our journals from the DDP participants. The Flickr site has photos, and then the blog site is pretty defunct. In fact, I'm probably going to take that blog site down because it's being misused by hackers now. They've hacked their way into it. So I'm probably just going to remove that site soon. That's it on the Decolonizing Diet Project, and I'll pause again for any questions related to that before I move into the next study.
We have another one here. How do you think we could combat the price issues to make this type of healthier food more readily / realistically available in general?
Yeah, one way is to really encourage your local stores to buy it in bulk when they can. The other way is for people to garden it. There are a lot of these things that could be foraged, that could be gardened if people are willing to do that. We've adapted some things to our gardens, and also realizing that some of the things that when people have gardens and they go out and weed their gardens, those are indigenous plants, edible plants that they're pulling out as weeds. Things like lamb's quarters and wood sorrel and sheep sorrel. Those are edible things, and they have a greater nutritional value than some other things that we might grow in our gardens, like spinach. So it really depends on how we think about it and how we act on that. But we can certainly put pressure on our local shops to start carrying some of these things. And yes, they're going to be a little more expensive because they're specialty foods, but if they buy them in bulk, that'll take it down. If one person goes in and orders it, it's going to be more expensive. But if 100 people go in and order it, it gets less expensive. So supply and demand. And I think that's something we just have to create the demand. All right. Are there any other DDP related questions or shall we go on with treaty food provisions?
There is one more question.
All right.
I might have you read it though, because there's
Is
some
that in the
words
chat
that
or
I'm not
Q&A?
in the Q&A.
All righty, I'll open that up. Okay, is there a seed bank component or community Kitagan as a result of the study? Also, were you able to incorporate the Hono Otam elder garden practices or other TEK that isn't part of woodland culture? Yeah, so we did have these movements toward developing community gardens. We had one community garden that was started on campus at Northern Michigan University, and they incorporated a number of indigenous foods. Unfortunately, there was an outcry from the neighbors where the garden was located that they had a squirrel that had gotten into the one of the watering containers and died, and was creating a smell. And the neighbors also didn't like that it was a no-mow area. And, we did that purposely because we didn't want people, mowing down edible plants around the edge of the garden. And we also didn't want people spraying or using toxic chemicals. And so that eventually had to get shut down because of public relations. But we also do have seed banks. There are a number of folks that have belonged to the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Alliance and they're seed savers. Rowan White, Rowen, White, is what I think of as the indigenous seed guru. And she has come to Northern Michigan on multiple occasions to provide her knowledge and best practices for seed saving and seed distribution. We also looked at things like, well, how did we distribute seeds, at different times in a pre-colonial context? How did we do that? How, was that accomplished? And so, one of the ways was through games, traditional games. There's a game called the two-sided dice, and Pagese win is what we call it. But it's a two-sided addition bowl game, or dice and bowl game. And seeds were used as the currency in that game. So it's kind of cool. The other question is, are the books available at GPRL, Grand Rapids Public Library? That's a question for you, Katie.
I was just looking it up. It doesn't look like we do, but I will certainly pass that on to our collection services department to see if we can order some. Great.
Rhonda, you're asking about hunting. Are tribal rules the same as state rules? And is the season the same or different? They're not the same. They're similar, but they're not the same. Our season, for instance, for Sioux tribe, our hunting season for deer begins the first Sunday in September, and it runs to the first Sunday in January. And I'm allowed to take 5 deer to myself. And then I can also apply for special permits for ceremonies. Like if I'm hunting for the tribe or for a tribal organization, I can actually take more deer. And then as far as fishing, we have the treaty rights to fish on the Great Lakes, to spearfish, to net fish, and to different species and different takes. So that's a little bit different, although we can hunt from shore with just our tribal IDs, and we can hunt from non-motorized boats like our canoes without a fishing permit. But when I'm not in my treaty ceded territory, on the other hand, I'm expected to comply with state and federal laws. Yes, the cookbook. Okay, hold on one second. I'll go back so you can write that down. So that's the Decolonizing Diet Project Cookbook. And I'll give you guys a few seconds to write that down. You can actually, if you go to Reinhardt Associates, all one word, .net, and click on Wawiaya, you can actually scroll down and order the cookbook at our site, or it's also available through the Northern Michigan University bookstore, or directly from the Center for Native American Studies for bulk orders. So if folks are ordering bulk, they can contact the Center for Native American Studies or contact me, and we can hook you up. Okay, I'm going to move back onto the treaty study now. Okay, so the treaty food provision study, this is one of my favorite images of all time. This is actually from an 1849 petition that was based on the 1842 Treaty of La Pointe, which is one of the treaties I was mentioning regarding the map of the treaty ceded territories. And this is an important image because, one, it was developed by Native leaders back during a time when our culture and our language is intact. When we were going through this this treaty negotiations with the United States. And the characters, the images that you see in this birch bark image, the one on the far right represents Crane Clan. And so my Native ancestry are Crane Clan, and I feel like I identify with that. The other characters there are other clans. And so you can see the Martin clan, Bear clan, Mer people, and Fish clan. And they're all connected to the Crane clan through these, what we call spirit lines. These spirit lines connect them to the heart and to the minds, or the eyes. Eyes are seen as like the mind's eye. And so it's very interesting that all the lines connect to the Crane clan. One of the things that we're taught is that Crane clan, one of their responsibilities is to engage with other communities, other countries, other entities, and speak on behalf of the people who have empowered the clan to speak on their behalf. Interestingly enough, there's also a line that connects the Crane to the earth and to the waters. And so not only does the person speak for the other humans, but also speaks for the earth and her other inhabitants. And so that says a lot about leadership perspectives and how we represent ourselves and others. So a very powerful image that I think is really important to understand from a contemporary context, especially when we're trying to figure out, well, what do these treaties mean? What is the meaning of these? So I completed a content analysis of all of the treaties made between the United States and American Indian tribes that were ratified by the US Senate. You can find those at the Oklahoma State University Library. And I'm not sure if you guys carry the Kapler's treaties at the Grand Rapids Public Library or not, but you can also find it online, of course. I used key terms, similar terms, and conceptual cluster searches. So examples include food, diet, subsistence, hunt, fish, gather, farm, agriculture, livestock, goods provision, subsist, and then other words that were essentially the same meaning. The treaty making period between American Indians and the United States was between 1778 and 1871. The first treaty signed between American Indian tribes in the United States was the treaty with the Delaware, or the Lenni Lenape. Lenni Lenape and Anishinaabe are culturally related. They're our distant cousins. And in 1871, the last of the treaties was actually signed. Actually, not the last treaty, but the US Congress included a rider in the Indian Appropriations Act prohibiting further treaty making. I think the last treaty was actually in 1868. But there are 372 treaties that were signed and ratified by the US Senate. And then there are 13 supplements that were subsequently ratified. This is an example of a treaty petition. And as you can see there, it's written in both Anishinaabe and English. I'm just going to read the English because I don't know how many of you speak Anishinaabe. Well, I will offer it to him, this which he asks of me, white pine. As far as you will cut, it's that where what I offer you. Not over here, having roots. I don't offer it to you. And again, this which I hold, maple, and this oak, and this one grass which I hold, manumin, or wild rice, I call it this, not these. I don't offer it to you. So this is really important language here. Gives us language for understanding what Indigenous leaders were thinking at that time. This was a transcript that was created back then during the 1864 petition. So regarding the 1847 treaty. So this is really important to having, again, that you have the image that was on birch bark, you have this transcript. We need to understand these things from those perspectives. Why is that all important? Because in the United States, we have these things called the Canons of Treaty Construction. This is the test that the US Supreme Court uses to understand treaty rights and how we interpret them today. There are three. The first is ambiguities in treaties must be resolved in favor of Indians. Well, I can tell you there's a great deal of ambiguity in treaty provisions. I like this idea of what happens in ambiguity stays in ambiguity, right? Or vagueness. What happens in vagueness stays in vagueness, like the Las Vegas. Anyway, I got that one mixed up. Mess that joke up. The second one is Indian treaties must be interpreted as the Indians would have understood them. So remember what I was saying, the image, the transcripts. How are we going to know those things? Well, that's what we're going to draw on as we're trying to figure out how did Indians understand these things. And then the last one is Indian treaties must be construed liberally in favor of Indians. And that literally means that if something can be seen as, like an annuity, if we said, say, Congress will provide this annuity for as long as we think proper, does that mean 0 years or 100 years or 200 years or infinity? Well, unless we apply the idea of liberally to that, we might be inclined to say, well, it's 0, right? Using a very conservative perspective on it. But a more liberal, in fact, the most liberal perspective would be that it's infinity if they don't otherwise say it's not going to be provided. And how does Congress say things? How does Congress talk to the public? Through legislation. So they would have to pass very explicit legislation tied to the treaty in order for it to say that it was no longer going to be provided. There are 295 of those treaties, including 734 articles between Indian tribes in the United States that are food related. That's a lot of reading, folks, by the way. My eyes were so buggy by the time I got done with that. And it's the second time I've gone through the treaties looking for provisions. The first study I did was education. This one was food. I'm getting ready to do another one for health. So within those treaties, there are rights to hunt, fish, and gather. There are 88 provisions in the body of treaties. Goods provisions and subsistence, 204. Support for farming and milling, 186. And then there are other provisions that may be a mix of those other ones, or something that is somewhat related, food related, like bowls, which could be specific, but it also might have been included under provisions or goods. So, I mean, those are things, maybe sometimes ammunition for hunting. So there's things like that as well. For the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi here in Michigan, and in other parts of the Great Lakes region, we have 52 treaties. 52, that's a lot of treaties for one cultural group that are related to food, with 107 articles. Of those, we have 25 that are rights to hunt, fish, and gather, 53 goods, provisions, and subsistence, 60 for support for farming and milling, and 24 for other. Okay, I'm going to pause there if anyone has any questions related to the treaty provisions for food study, and I'll try to answer those. Katie?
Not seeing anything in the Q&A quite yet. You can wait a moment if anyone has questions, though.
Or in the chat room, maybe. And you don't have to have questions. If you don't have questions, that means I was just very thorough and I've completely soaked your brains and you have no questions. All right, if you do have questions, we can also come back to them. Oh, it looks like we maybe do.
Where can I find details on these treaties?
Yes, so that's a great question. We are in the process of writing a book right now, my wife and I, and we'll have that hopefully published within a year. So that study will be in there. If you're looking for the treaties themselves to look at, you can go to the website I showed there at Oklahoma State University, or just do a simple Google search for Kapler's treaties. Kapler's is Kappler's, and treaties. And Katie, did you figure out if you guys have Kapler's, like the bound volume in your library?
I haven't. No, I'll have to look it up and see.
Okay, so that's something that may be in the library. It's a federal document that was deposited in a lot of libraries. But if not, you can find it online easily enough at Oklahoma State University Library, who digitized the bound volume to online. And it's searchable, which is really cool.
Let's see. Is the 1837 explicit in subsistence fishing dialogue?
Yep. So it's actually 1836, and it really does speak specifically to fishing, although there are also implications. It's a right to hunt, fish, and gather. And so that is the treaty, though, that the Judge Noel Fox in the famous Fox decision for the state of Michigan, tribes, 1836 tribes at least, focused on that treaty as the basis for saying we still have treaty rights on the Great Lakes to fish, and we can use traditional methods, or we can use contemporary methods for that. So that was a really important treaty as far as challenges go. It looked like someone had their hand raised. I'm not sure how do you handle hand raising in a webinar?
Let me see here.
The person that had their hand
It
raised
says it was an accident.
Oh, okay, no problem. If anyone has any questions, if you put it in the chat or the Q&A. If not, we will move on. Okay, if you do have questions, we can always come back. Don't be afraid to ask. We're going to go into the next part of the presentation, which is another study that my wife and I did when I was on sabbatical in 2018. And this is Indigenous Foods, TEK, Traditional Ecological Knowledge in the Great Lakes region. And I just call it IFTEC for short. But we have this title slide for this section. That is a pictograph that is focused on Nanabuju. Nanabuju is a representative character in our traditional stories for the Anishinaabe people, and it's it represents the human being in spirit form, and a lot of our lessons learned come from Nanabuju stories. And so Nanabuju there is represented as like a human form with big, like, rabbit ears. And so it's very common to see Nanabuju depicted in this way. I like these pictographs because, to me, they're direct messages from our native ancestors to future generations. And when I say future generations, that includes native and non-native, because non-native people can learn from these as well. So for the IFTEC project, we recruited traditional knowledge holder participants using a snowball sampling approach, and we interviewed them using video, audio, photography, and written notes. We used first-person accounts, so both the TEK holders and myself and Tina as researchers, along with analysis by myself. We are also engaging in opportunities for the traditional knowledge holders to review and edit the book before we publish it. So their section of the book, they'll have opportunities to say, you know what, I shouldn't have said that, or maybe I would add this or change this word, or maybe I spelled something wrong that they said. So that's something that's a little unusual for studies, and it's an important component, I think, for what it is that we're doing. It's respect for tribal sovereignty over tribal cultural data, and for the families to have an opportunity to do that. We're also providing opportunities for tribal governments to review and provide feedback before finalization and publication, if they so choose. So TEK is a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief evolving by adaptive processes and handed down through generations by cultural transmission about the relationship of living beings, including humans, with one another and their environment. That definition comes from Burks, Colding, and Folk in Rediscovery of Traditional Ecological Knowledge as Adaptive Management. McGregor says Aboriginal knowledge is a package deal. It comes complete with its original holders, without which it cannot properly function. Robin Wall Kimmerer, one of my favorite authors, and Robin is a Anishinaabe Potawatomi ethnobotanist, says that TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, remains a proudly subjective, qualitative, holistic, and relational knowledge that encompasses mind, body, and emotion and spirit. SEK, scientific ecological knowledge, adheres to its tradition of a proudly objective, quantitative, short-term, reductionist, and materialist knowledge that privileges its intellectual schema for strictly empirical knowledge. In other words, the scientific method. Together, importantly, they can create a new kind of knowledge that will lead us to true embodied sustainability. This is a really important quote because, right now we need this more than ever. We need to focus on sustainability in our world. And if TEK and SEK used together can get us there, we need to be doing more of this stuff, folks. So we had 3 common interview questions for our interviewees, our traditional knowledge holders. First one is, how did you come to know what you know about Indigenous foods? The second, what do you do on an annual basis based on what you learned about Indigenous foods? And the third, how do you share what you've learned with others? So I'm just going to go through these quickly to make sure we don't run out of time for the rest of the presentation. We did leek harvesting with Amy Cree-Dunn and Leora Lancaster, 2 of our youngest traditional knowledge holders. And, this was one of those things we did early in the spring. And, language and identity played key roles in, the knowledge that they were able to get from others. Leora learning a lot about these things from her family, her grandmother especially, and then Amy working with not necessarily her own family, but with other elders in her community, and learning these things from some of them from books that she read. So sometimes the knowledge comes to us in different ways. That is also a fiddlehead, by the way, on the left there. That is from an ostrich fern, one of the types you can eat. The things sitting on the log there, those are wild ramps or leeks. Cooking fish and making tea with Greg Johnson and Mary Moose. Greg's a little bit older than Leora and Amy. He's still a young man, but he has a lot of traditional knowledge. He made it his business to learn a lot about food in traditional ways. In this thing here, he's cooking a muskie fish on birch bark buried under a fire. And so it was really cool. He also made maple sugar for us that day. And then Mary Moose, who is a traditional Ojibwe elder, who has some wonderful stories to share. She is making tea that we went out and foraged leaves for over the fire there. One of my friends, Tina and my friends that we went to college with, Daisy is Cree from up at James Bay in Ontario. she made beaver stew. And so she was telling us how they trapped the beaver, how they cleaned it, and how it can be used, different cooking methods. In this particular one, we were making beaver stew at the Anishinaabe language camp, Kenny Pheasants camp down at the Little River Band. Monica Katie, who is about my age, she has her home out in Hessel, Michigan, and she really focuses on indigenous plants and making sure that her guard is a no-mow area, no toxics, chemicals, and you can see her land, her sign there. This land is managed for wildlife, medicinal herbs, no hunting, gathering, or trespassing. And so she draws on both her native and indigenous from folks ancestry from Anishinaabe, but she also has ancestry from the Czech Republic. Her grandmother was a master gardener and herbologist who was not necessarily schooled or educated in it, but everyone in the area knew her as that. So she was a traditional knowledge holder, and she carries both of those traditions with her, which is really cool. We paid a visit to the Red Lake Nation Food Summit and visited their food sovereignty initiatives with Michael Van Horn and David Manuel. And it's amazing, if you ever get an opportunity. That is Red Lake Nation College, by the way, in the background there. Isn't that a cool structure with an eagle, adorning the front entrance and the wings spreading out over the wings of the school? Anyway, they have a number of things going on up there. They have community gardens. They have wild rice processing and fish hatchery and fish stocking in their lake for walleye. They're one of the main native distributors of walleye and wild rice in the United States. And this was so cool. Don and Carlene Chosa. Don and I worked together at Northern Michigan University back in the day when he was working there. He was our Anishinaabe language instructor. But he and his family have been wild ricing for years and years, going way back. And so he was showing us how they can process it. Even when you're not in a traditional area and you don't have the traditional tools, you can still do these kind of processes in your backyard, which he was on the Keweenaw Indian Community Reservation, where they weren't even allowed. It's kind of funny. They're not allowed to have fires on the ground, so he had to use a patio fireplace. You would think on an Indian reservation you could have fires on the ground, but it just wasn't the case. So anyway, that was a really fun time we had with them processing rice. My wife's sister, Karen Moses, when she was growing up, one of the things she loved to do in their family is to pick berries. And so Karen, every year she goes out and she starts with the first berries of the year and goes right to the last berries of the year. And, it's just, I don't know how her back takes all of that stooping over and spending so much time out there, and the flies, the mosquitoes, and she doesn't seem to be afraid of snakes either. So, but boy, I'll tell you what, we sure enjoy her berries and her pies and her jams and such. It's so nice. Karen is also a combat veteran. She does this in some ways, I think, as therapy. It brings her back home, and it helped her deal with some of those things that she was dealing with as a warrior. Processing Oneida corn with Laura Manthe and Robin Johns. It was so beautiful to see this family go out. They plant their corn by hand. They are Oneida over in Wisconsin, the Oneida Reservation. They plant their corn by hand. They harvest it by hand, and you can see they braid it. Every single ear of corn is touched by loving human hands. There is such a great relationship between these folks and their corn. It's just beautiful. They'll be coming up to do green corn roasting at the symposium we're having September 19th to the 21st at Northern Michigan University in the Keweenaw Indian community. We visited with Greg Johnson again, and Leon Valier, also goes by Boise. We went and we tried to do spear fishing by torchlight at Lac de Flambeau, where they live. One of the reasons is because I was very curious about the name of the tribe, Lac de Flambeau, and the lake. And if you look in the historical documents, they're famous for torching by or spearing fish by torchlight over there. And so we asked them, could you demonstrate that for us? And they did. They showed us how they gathered the pine pitch, how they created the torches, and how they, using a birch bark canoe, went out and tried to spearfish. We didn't get any fish that evening, but at least we got to see how the process happened, which was really cool. So I'm so glad they didn't fall in the water though. So you heard me mention Robin Wall Kimmer at the beginning of this section of the presentation. She's the one that had the quote about SEK and TEK. And we went and gathered dogbane over in New York with her. Dogbane fibers are used in many ways like nettle fibers are. It's another source of fibrous plant tissue that is used for making rope and for tying baskets and such. And so, but Robin is also one of the advisors for this study. And so she wrote Braiding Sweetgrass and Gathering Moss, 2 books that you should read. If you don't read these books, you just got to, believe me, you'll love her books. Eloquent writer, but she's so in touch with the plant world. It's amazing. So she's an advisor for this study. The Haudenosaunee Food Sovereignty Initiatives with Angela Ferguson and Roger Cook, you saw them standing at the Red Lake with us. They were up at that summit. So we went and visited them over in New York also. And they have huge gardens at the Haudenosaunee farms that we visited. And they have one of the largest repositories of native corn seed. They have over 3,000 indigenous varieties of corn. When you walk into this climate controlled room and you see all this corn, these corn ancestors are just talking to you. You almost get this sense of awe. It almost makes you cry. It's so overwhelming, the feeling you get walking in there. And just knowing that, the corn that we eat as Americans is so limited to just a few varieties. But here's all this beautiful corn that was raised by how many different cultures and, still survives and to this day. And they have many of them. And unlike the Svalbard repository over in Iceland, they want people to come in and take these corn seeds out and grow them and then return new seeds to their repository. They said that's the only way that you can ensure that they'll still be viable. You don't want to leave these things sitting too long to where they don't become viable anymore. And that also ensures the spread of the seed across many places in case of drought or in case of, pollution or whatever, that they'll still have the seeds in different communities. I visited with Winona LaDuke. Those of you who know of Winona know she is a very major activist. She was a vice presidential candidate along with Ralph Nader for 2 tries for the president of the United States on the Green Party ticket. And, so she's done a lot with indigenous food revitalization and protection. And so we had an opportunity to go visit her farm where they do a lot of food work there. And she also has the Indigenous Farming Conference, which is the photos there of the luncheon on the bottom, and the other photo on the side there of the 2 of the people involved, Chef Sean Sherman and he's gonna be upset with me. I'm blanking on his name at the moment. Anyway, he plays banjo and he's a really cool guy. I'll come back to that. I'm blanking on his name right now. In the following spring, we went to the Sugar Bush at Dynamite Hill Farms with Jerry Jondro and Katie Brissett and pulled out about 200 gallons from the maple trees the day we were visiting there. A lot of hard work. I'm not a young man anymore, and it's really hard, especially when you forget your snowshoes. You go sinking way down in the snow. But it's something that the Anishinaabe Indian community produced back in the early colonial days. They were producing millions and millions of gallons of syrup and sugar and maple products. They were the largest producer in the world. And so one of the things that Jerry wants to do is revitalize that connection for his community. rather than, local governments or tribal governments clear cutting these beautiful life-giving maple trees, getting them encouraged to tap them and to revitalize that connection to the world economy. Some of the final interviews we did, we made fish powder with Mary Moose, who I talked about earlier. And she taught us how to make fish powder, kind of like a trail snack out of dried fish and berries and nuts using a butagan. And that's a traditional butagan made out of a silver birch. And then Dan Cornelius, who is the person who has been working on intertribal food summits, coordinating them. He also showed us how to make a spice out of corn cob ashes. And then we had an opportunity to interview Sean Sherman, the Lakota or Sioux, S-I-O-U-X chef, the Sioux chef, it's a play on words, who is also the owner of the first Indigenous restaurant in Minneapolis, right there on the Mississippi River, called Owamni. And then a non-native person who we interviewed was Kevin Finney. Kevin Finney has a background in anthropology and archaeology, and has really taken it on himself to learn about our Anishinaabe traditions and to help revitalize those traditions. He believes that that is one of the things that he's supposed to do in life, is to help us get it back. So that's really cool that he's doing that, especially as a non-native. I'm going to pause real quick before I get into these preliminary findings and just take some questions, Katie.
Sure, yeah, we have a few here. So about the DDP section, ideas for simple snacks, quickly ready, or even possibly able to prepare ahead of time. I personally struggle the most with healthy snacks.
Yeah, so like blue corn chips, that are lightly salted with, and use healthy salt, don't use iodized salt. It has anti-caking agent in it, the iodine. I know some, they recommend that we have iodine in our diet, but there's other sources. So the anti-caking agent is not really something that you would want to have, in my opinion, but there's like Himalayan sea salt, there's sea salt, there's, if you're really good at it, going and finding the natural salt that occurs in the near surface salt mines, or the salt water that comes out of the natural springs. But those are sometimes difficult to find, and it takes a lot of work. So maybe using sea salt or Himalayan salt is a close approximation. If you're someone who eats nuts, pecans are a nut that grows in the Great Lakes region. They're available on the marketplace. And those roasted in the oven with a little bit of maple sugar on them, or syrup, and a little sea salt again, those are a great snack. I like zucchini spears, and it's something that I often eat as a snack in the summertime, and very healthy for you. And we all know, if you're a gardener, zucchinis, man, you have to be like a terrible gardener not to grow zucchini. And so sometimes you're trying to figure out what to do with it. That's one use. It's real simple. Just slice it up and maybe put a little bit of DDP spice on it, whether it's sea salt or leek salt or what have you. And so then there's also cookies. Everyone's a fan of cookies, right? So you can make cookies out of pumpkin seed flour and pecans and sun butter, sunflower. If you grind up sunflower seeds past, where they're flour, they'll turn into sun butter. And so you can use like duck eggs and make this really cool cookie that's just so good and so nutritious. So there's a few ideas.
Let's see, across all treaty provisions, is there assurance that a sustainable and sustaining diet can be provided? Thinking encroachments might cut tribes off from one class or type of food that would leave diet unbalanced.
Yeah, so I really encourage people to use gardening, like have their personal gardens. So that way we don't bum rush nature, right? So as far as plants go, the more we can have our own gardens and be responsible for those, then we don't have a whole bunch of people rushing out and gathering leeks all at the same time and destroying the leek populations, and for other plants as well. I really encourage people to follow honorable harvest guidelines that Robin Wall Kimmerer explains in her books. Don't take the first one you see, don't take the last one, don't take more than you need, leave some for others. Things that are just be responsible, be a good person. And some of it's just common sense. Don't pull out plants by their roots, take the fruits, don't take all the leaves off a plant. They need them to photosynthesize. So just think, sustainably. And if you're not sure, don't do it.
Will this seminar and information be available to view after the fact? Yes, we are recording the session and we'll have it up on the library's YouTube page for the rest of the month anyway. And then, is braiding corn just aesthetic?
No, actually, it's a great way to maximize space. And they use that method to dry the corn. And so they will peel back the husk and they'll braid it, and then they'll hang it from the rafters to dry. And so then after it's dry, they'll separate out the corn that's going to be used to eat, the corn that's going to be used for seed, and then the corn that they'll give away. And so it's mostly for drying, but it is very beautiful.
And can you explain what green corn is?
Yeah, so green corn is when it's picked, it's not quite ripe, and it is edible. And what the folks who are going to do when they come up is show us how they roast it and how they prepare it, so that way other folks can enjoy that too. I often liken it to the idea of, like, people eat green tomatoes. So it's a different taste, of course, but it is still edible in its green state.
Okay, I think we are caught up for now.
Cool. All right. So yeah, we have about 15 minutes left. I'm just going to go through this and hit our last study, which is very short because it's still in the middle of the study. But some important findings from the TEK is that TEK and SEK are not polar opposites. But there are a lot of misgivings between the TEK knowledge holders and the SEK knowledge holders based on historical circumstances. And there's a lot of Native people who don't trust Western institutions for good reason. They've been used against us. I don't know if you guys are aware of it or not, but they're the boarding schools in the United States and Canada. They're finding mass graves of Indian children who are buried there, without names on the graves, and they're over 2,000 now that they've dug up or that they've discovered with the ground penetrating radar systems. So a lot of SEK folks undervalue traditional knowledge. They say, okay, well, that's all superstition or whatever. And so it makes for bad relations. And so it's really important that we work on building those relations and that we begin valuing from both sides. Ceremony is a real central component of the interactions between human and non-human. And that is something that, ceremonies, as Robin Wall Kimmerer explained, make us accountable to the community. We have to actually voice things in a way that is spoken, and then people understand, that we are responsible for these things, that we have relations that need to be accounted for and cared for. The origins of traditional ecological knowledge are multiple and variable. And sometimes, as I had said, they come from family or non-family, native or non-native, sometimes from the literature. And I think, what I find most special is that sometimes that traditional knowledge has to be rediscovered. It has to come to us again, and it comes right from the plants and animals or Mother Earth themselves. The relationship between TEK and food sovereignty is apparent in the references to treaties and tribal laws. There are several folks who see a direct link between their knowledge and how they are able to use the laws, their treaty rights or tribal laws, to still participate in traditional ecological knowledge activities. There are several of the folks who fear that some of the TEK is going to be lost, and that they have kind of an emergency situation right now for their families and communities, especially for those communities that have been more disrupted than others. For the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, for instance, we are down to maybe 0 to a handful of Anishinaabe language speakers who are from our community. There are some folks who know a lot about one or a few things, whereas some know more about, a lot of things, but nothing real in depth. And so I think it's a value that we have to recognize, is that not everyone's going to know, things as deep as others, and some may not know a lot about a lot of things. The idea of sharing traditional ecological knowledge, it mostly happens with family, but there are others in the community and even students who are entrusted with that knowledge. And I think we have to be aware of that. My job as a professor, I try to encourage students, especially the Native students, to take advantage of the opportunities to learn about their traditional ecological knowledge from their families and communities, because we have these elders who are not going to be around forever. There is a concern about not enough young people that are interested in this idea. There's a lot of the folks who are learning it are elders, or who have this knowledge. And so we want to really encourage youth to get out there and learn these things, because they're the future. And then, as I had spoken about with my sister-in-law, the impact on healing historic trauma, PTSD, and drug and alcohol addictions. It's not just Karen that has spoken about that. There's a lot of folks who say that just being out in nature helps heal them. Just being there, it just rebalances you, recenters you. Our publication is going to be released hopefully soon, within the year, from the Minnesota Historical Society. Christy Belcourt, some of you may know who she is. She's a famous Métis artist who does this beautiful floral patterns. We asked her if she would provide this for our cover design. Okay, the last study is the one I'm currently in right now, and it's called the Great Lakes Indigenous Materials Poop Study. Yes, it is poop. The purpose of GLIMPS is to contribute to the knowledge that exists regarding the methods and materials that we used here in the Great Lakes region prior to colonization for pooping. The image here is me and Tina going out and clearing space in our woods here for my poop field, so I can go out and experiment for my study. There's 3 components of the study. The first is a literature review, and I worked with the students in one of my classes to identify references to Indigenous poop. We had 13 students in there, and they each contributed to the literature review and found several references. Not all of them were specifically about Great Lakes region or specific to any one thing, but we use a number of identifiers, terms that we searched for in the literature, and came up with about 60 references. Again, I'm still going through those references to pull them out into the literature review section. The second component is a traditional knowledge interviews, and using a snowball method, I recruited very few individuals who were actually willing to share traditional knowledge about this topic, unlike food. So I've actually only been contacted now by 4 people who said they might interview. I've actually interviewed 1 at this point, and I have another one set up for later this month. The other 2 still haven't gotten back with me, even though they initially showed interest. So as far as interviews, it might just be because it's sometimes a taboo subject to talk about. People just don't like talking about poop. It's not something you commonly talk about at the dinner table, and see people, I think, get a little bit, I don't know, they're embarrassed to talk about it, I think. So I'm only asking 1 question, and then I have probing questions for the interviewees. And the question that I ask is, based on your background and experience, what can you tell us about materials and methods used by Indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region for pooping? So in the last study, you see that I interviewed Mary Moose, and thank goodness Mary Moose was willing to also be part of this study. And she had some really cool things to tell me, which I'm not going to reveal yet. Because I'm still working on her transcript, and I want to give her the opportunity to read through her transcript before sharing those things. And then the last component is the experimentation. And the experimentation is based on my own experience and the literature and the interviews. And I set up a seasonal experiment. We're using cat holes and a midden or refuse pit to dispose of my poop. I'm also going to leave it open on the ground. I'm going to add that component there as one of the methods. And I'm only using indigenous materials for wiping my behind. So with the literature review, the middens and caves seem to have the greatest preponderance of evidence for pre-colonial poop that's been studied. And looking specifically at terra preta and stainalls as evidence of indigenous poop. Terra preta is this exquisite fertile soil from Central and South America that was created over thousands of years by the native people. And it's just beautiful soil, but it's a mix of poop and compost, charcoal and ashes and soil. And they just built it up over years and years and years. And it's some of the most fertile soil on the face of the earth. Stainalls are one of the ways that we can find out what was in the poop that they found, the coprolites, the petrified poop. And it's also something that they find on lakes that native people live nearby. They can tell about, what, based on the things that float to the top of the water, they can take the sample and they can tell us, what the animals were, that there were humans in the area, that there was these different foods that they ate, because the poop gets rained on, snowed on, and then it, ends up in the water tables. None of the literature review that I've read so far focuses directly on the Great Lakes region, which is interesting. One of the reasons for that is because we're extremely wet environment, and we don't have a lot of arid conditions where or caves where these things would be found. So, and for the interviews, I'm including my own experience using cat holes. My grandmother, my Ojibwe grandmother, showed us how to use cat holes when we were little on Sugar Island, where we would go out and dig holes and use whatever we had around, leaves or pine cones or whatever, to wipe our behinds. And so I'm using that experience, but I'm also using the experience I'm getting from the recorded interviews. And so incorporating those ideas and literature. For the experiment, I have the field where we have the holes and the midden. I began using it July 25th, and I'm taking field notes and photos and a little bit of video. So there's my first cat hole. You can see by the shovel on the top, and there's the pit. The cat hole, the first stuff I used was oak leaves, and oak leaves are not very good, by the way. The bottom there, the first material I used was thimbleberry leaves, which are much better than oak leaves. They are a little more rough, and so they get more stuff. Had some visitors to the site already, mostly bugs and flies and mosquitoes and deer. The deer like that open area where they can find the young grass shoots. There is my email address if anyone has any questions later on that we didn't get to this evening. It is 8:29, and I'll leave it up to Katie if we have time for any more questions.
Yeah, it looks like there's a few more. Let's see here. Did Native Americans eat field corn like South Americans do?
Yeah, so there's different types of corn. We have dent corn. Some corns that are mostly used for flour. We have the sweet corn varieties, and then what people know as field corn. And so it's really a matter of, all of the corns can be eaten by humans. It's just a matter of how did humans eat them, from the teosinte all the way to the modern day varieties of sweet corn. All of them were eaten by humans at one time or another. It's just nowadays we have field corn that is used for feeding cows or livestock. and for, I'm sure it's being used in different ways by the corporations, mixing with other products or whatever. But all of these corns have been used by humans for human food throughout the ages. So, for instance, hominy, hominy corn requires nixtamalization, uh, essentially giving it a bath in ashes, hardwood ashes, and that nixtamalizes or unlocks properties in the corn that make it more nutritious for humans to consume. So there are different ways that we've interacted with these corns throughout the ages.
Excuse me, were rules or laws put into place other than those that are multicultural put into place to aid in eliminating DDP food?
Okay, so from a non-native perspective, yes, there were laws that were created. I mean, besides the obvious things that they did, the colonizers going out and destroying cornfields and wild rice fields and slaughtering buffalo and, just to, impact Indian populations because they wanted to remove us from our homelands. But then, if you think about the kind of rules that exist today, whether that is like the grants that are available for agriculture, they certainly favor non-native foods, and they also favor a lot of GMO. And so it's hard to get grants to support the work that we're doing with indigenous foods. And even like the information that's contained within like USDA guidelines or like nutrition charts and stuff, that mostly has to do with non-native foods. So yeah, there are policies that are directly anti-indigenous foods, but then there are other policies that are more subtle. They're biased toward non-native foods, and so that can be problematic. And that's all on top of the treaties and the limited access to land, even within our traditional homelands, to where we can get access to even grow these things or find them.
Okay, here's another one. I am not Indigenous, but I would like my children to have an understanding of TEK. I've noticed a lot of the teaching in my children's classrooms are SEK based. In other words, let's gather plants to build a terrarium instead of let's go into the woods and observe the plants we see. What resources do you recommend for schools and classrooms, especially K through 8?
Yeah, so the let's see, it's the 13 Moons curriculum is something that was put together by Honor the Earth organization with Winona LaDuke. And so that's something that the Intertribal Council of Michigan has adopted and is getting out to schools. So that's something that teachers could look into. I also teach a course called Native American Inclusion in the Classroom, and where I actually teach teachers how to create interdisciplinary thematic units that focus on American Indian topics. And that is something that makes total sense, is to have these thematic units focus on indigenous foods. And it's something that younger teachers may be more aware of that. It's something that's taught nowadays. It may not be something that older teachers who've been in the classroom for years and years may be less familiar with it. But it's something that they could certainly get through professional development if they're so inclined. But that is, I think, the best way for our schools to integrate native food content is through interdisciplinary thematic units.
Okay, here's another one. Speaking of poop, it might be interesting to compare the microbiome of the poop of individuals on a DDP diet to those on a typical Western diet.
Absolutely. Yeah, one of the spin-offs from the DDP, we've been asked, would we be interested in duplicating our study, but this time with a focus on gut biome comparisons and samples. And yes, our answer was yes, just as long as somebody actually provides the funding. We did the DDP on $17,000 a year-long food study with $17,000. We scrimped and saved, and we did a lot of free stuff, a lot of volunteerism. But really, we needed, hundreds of thousands of dollars to do something that's going to have the weight it needs to really get out there into the, into the communities where it needs to be. That being said, the DDP itself has been featured in medical journals. There are medical schools now that know about the DDP, including the Mayo Clinic. So we're known, and that was a $17,000 small study. So, yeah.
Okay, we've got time for one more, I think.
Okay.
Were you raised on a great deal of DDP food, or was this something that came of interest to you on your own?
Yeah, so my mom is Anishinaabe Ojibwe, as I've said, and she was married to my non-native biological father, who is Irish American, and makes me gibberish. And then, he left our home when I was a baby, and then, we spent a lot of time with my mom's family until I was around 5 years old. And then my mom married my adoptive father, who is a German American farmer. And so we had, during my young life, a mix of a lot of farm raised, chicken and steak. And, I didn't really like steak as a kid because I just don't think, I think we had too much of it. And I don't know, I don't want to say anything about my grandmother's cooking, but she could really cook some good food, except steak. I just did not like the way she cooked steak. It was just very dry and tough all the time. But anyway, but we ate a lot of farm raised food and a lot of organic food. And then we ate a lot of venison around my mom's family. It was all a lot of venison and fish. And but we also had some really bad stuff around my mom's family, commodity food from the US government. It was commodity cheese and a lot of salt and a lot of lard and the really bad things for your body, a lot of processed foods, as government food subsidies. And so, that is something that I had to look at and say, geez, I love the memories of family and the foods we ate together, but I now realize that some of it was really not good food. And so it was important to me to think about my relationship with food and how I wanted to relate to these things. And then also have a respect, a great, to revitalize a great respect for the foods that are indigenous to this place we call home with a capital H. These foods have been here for a lot longer than humans have. And it's really important that we show that respect for them because it's not just native history we're talking about here. It's a shared native, non-native history, human relationships with the indigenous world around us. Thank you all for being here for the presentations this evening. I hope that they were informative, and I hope they piqued your interest and that you'll now go out and do some really cool things and be a great supporter of Indigenous Foods movement.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reinhardt.